I live in the real world where men sell propane and propane accessories.
They play for the Governor's Victory Bell, which dates back to 1993.
But to be the man, you gotta beat the man, and I'm saying, woo, right here.
You're listening to The Review on the OSG Podcasting Network.
Hey, thanks for tuning in, everybody. You are listening to another, or if you're on the YouTube page, I guess you're watching another episode of The Review. It's the OSG Sports weekly recap of the weekend in college football. And joining me this week, Brother Wilkie at jwilkerson16. And Wilkie, we got a few odd things to talk about. It was an interesting week. I'm thinking maybe we start with something that you might be a little bit more familiar with than I am, and that's the situation at Arkansas, where we have a little breaking news, and that Chad Morris is no longer the head coach.
Which is something that, that precedent was set the week before when Florida State decided to get rid of Willie Taggart in his midway through his second year. And we kind of wondered, well, that Western Kentucky-Arkansas game, that might be the telltale sign of whether there's going to be a move made on Chad Morris. And with the uninspired effort by the Razorbacks against the former Razorback quarterback and Ty Story, the Hunter Yurachek, the athletic director at Arkansas, made the move the next day. And Barry Lunny Jr. will be the interim head coach at Arkansas for the remaining of the season. It just came to the point, Phil, where something had to give, and it was time to make the move. There's money there for the buyout. They're not paying Bielema anymore, so there was cash on hand there, and as I look back on it, it just looked like he was out of his league. He thought he could come in and bring somewhat what he brought to Clemson as the offensive coordinator and what he was building in SMU to the SEC, and it just didn't work out. I mean, there was no defense there. He couldn't settle on a quarterback. I'd love the move of bringing John Stephen Jones in as the starting quarterback and giving KJ Jefferson some time, because I thought, you don't want to burn KJ's red shirt, and he was kind of tailor-made for that offense. But when you just got uninspired efforts from all around the ball, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's hard to stay relevant when you're when you're losing games to Western Kentucky, you're losing them badly.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to convince the fan base it's worth coming out to the games. And I'm like you, I really thought this was a good hire initially when Morris made the move. He had some success at SMU. He was highly regarded as an offensive coordinator. But at the end of the day, in some instances, and maybe this is the case too, great offensive coordinators don't always make great head coaches.
Well, I think he had a pedigree. I mean, you think about the quarterbacks he had at Clemson with Taj Boyd and Deshaun Watson and what he turned them into. But he was building that at SMU. But it just didn't work out when he got into the SEC. That's a whole different animal, especially the SEC West. But you cannot lose 45-19 to Western Kentucky at home on senior day. And if it wasn't for Raheem Boyd and the 185 yards rushing that he had, I think Arkansas's total offense would have been below 80 yards. So it was really two really big Raheem Boyd runs that was the offense for Arkansas. And they made a late run, obviously, in the fourth quarter, but, Ty Story threw for a touchdown and, 22 of 32 coming back home. He's from Charleston, Arkansas, which is about a 2-hour drive from Fayetteville South. Something had to be done. Move had to be made. It was just ever since the Colorado State win, it's been an uninspired effort. And, it was starting to show in the stands. It was a pretty pathetic crowd that was at the Western Kentucky game. And that was the final game in Fayetteville this year too.
Yeesh. Not a bad job. Real briefly here and quickly so we can get on with some other stuff. Any idea who might be somebody that the university is going to look at and think might be a good move or somebody to bring in for this job?
Well, you're going to hear the usual candidates from every other job. Mike Leach is out there. He's going to be tied into Florida State and Arkansas, and Lane Kiffin will be tied into those jobs. And we'll hear obviously the Urban Meyer, Bob Stoops names popped around for both jobs. I'm sure that's going to happen. Just kind of initially looking at the list, there's some interesting names here that I think would be good fits. Or interesting fits at least. Bill Clark's name from UAB has been mentioned. One name I like is Eli Drinkwitz at Appalachian State. He's got Arkansas ties. He's from Oklahoma. He was at Springdale High School for a while and was an assistant at Arkansas State. I believe he married a girl. No, that's Memphis coach that I'm thinking of.
Norvell.
Mike Norvell. He married, and he's going to be on the list too. I imagine he's going to be the popular choice among the fans, simply because of the success he's had in Memphis. But the one name I see on some of these lists that I really like, Norvell. Obviously he's got ties. I think his wife is from Salem Springs, which is about an hour and a half drive northwest of Fayetteville, around the Arkansas-Oklahoma border. I may be wrong in that, but I know he's got ties to the state. He played at UCA at Central Arkansas, so he's going to be a very popular choice, and he might be the best fit. I like Billy Napier at Louisiana. Especially if they want to continue the trend in the SEC of hiring Nick Saban assistants. This is a guy that should be the head coach at Arizona State, and he was the offensive coordinator there. And when the whole thing happened with Herm Edwards coming in, he was kind of named the head coach in waiting, and he didn't want to wait. He had the opportunity in Lafayette, Louisiana, to get it done, and he did. But he's been in Dabo Swinney's. He was an assistant for Dabo for 3 years at Clemson and for Nick Saban at Alabama. And so he's got the pedigree and he's having success at Louisiana. Yep. So I think, they're 7-2 right now. So
likely going to win the Sun Belt.
Right. So that's the name I really like. I think he'd be a really good fit. And would be a guy that has a winning pedigree. Mm-hmm. And I kind of, Norvell, I think would be good. And I think Eli Drinkwitz would be good too. He's got a gimmick offense though. But he develops quarterbacks into the NFL. And that's one thing Arkansas hasn't been able to do really since Bobby Petrino was there, was develop a quarterback. And, those are three names I kind of like, but we're going to hear the same names that are going to be tied to every job. And we're going to hear what plane tail number is on its way to Fayetteville and what coach is in that said plane. So this should be fun to watch.
Indeed. Speaking of fun to watch, did you get a chance to catch any of the LSU-Alabama game of the week, game of the century, game of the decade, millennium, and all that other stuff?
Game of the millennium, huh? I got to see a little of it when I got back from my daughter's basketball game.
It was an interesting game. I was totally impressed with what LSU did.
Edwards-Helaire. They will score.
And the thing that really, I think, jumped off the table to me in the 46-41 win, it wasn't a game that was as close as the score would indicate from my perspective. What was interesting to me is LSU looked like a team that had played tough games and knew when they had to kick it up a notch and grind out a little bit harder. Alabama really hadn't been tested up to this point. Their schedule has been incredibly soft. They didn't have anybody really challenge them really up until now. And LSU really took it to them hard. And I think you can make, with the polls that are already starting to come out, you can make a pretty good argument that LSU really might very well be the best team in college football this season.
Yeah, I think if you're going to go by eye test, LSU and Ohio State are probably the two best teams in the country. The latest AP poll that came out yesterday has LSU number 1, Ohio State number 2, Clemson 3, Alabama staying in the top 4. But Clemson to me is also starting to pass that eye test. But I got to agree with you with LSU. I like the fight and the comeback by Alabama. You expected that to happen, but LSU looks like a team that's a team of destiny. Don't you think? I mean,
Yeah.
just, Joe Burrow is that quarterback, that it quarterback right now, that, I would say right now he is the top candidate for the Heisman Trophy. But you're right. I think they've really, really improved. I've got to go. I got to tip my hat to Joe Brady, the passing game coordinator,
and probably the assistant coach of the year.
Yeah, he's probably going to win the Broyles Award. But a lot of that too is they brought John Robinson in as a consultant, the former Southern Cal coach, and he is another brilliant offensive brain. And they've done a great job of getting those type of athletes to help Joe Brady or to help Joe Burrow out, and he's comfortable in that system now. And Joe Burrow's a guy that is not afraid to put his head down either, and he's got some moxie out there. And I don't know if you could say that about LSU quarterbacks in the past. So yeah, they look like a team of destiny out there, and I'm anxious to see how LSU is going to finish out their season. Of course, the remaining games are hosting Arkansas and Texas A&M. Of course, they got Ole Miss this week in Oxford, which should be a win. And then Arkansas and Texas A&M, to me, they're going to run the table.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and we're looking at an LSU Georgia SEC championship game at this point, barring something incredibly weird happening between now and then. A game that LSU is going to be heavily favored in. Moving on a little bit, another game that was of some interest this week, and a lot of people called it an upset. I don't know if it's as big of an upset as people would think it would be, and that's Minnesota taking down Penn State.
Clifford again has time, throws, and it is intercepted in the end zone by Jordan Howden. They play for the Governor's Victory Bell, which dates back to 1993 when Penn State came into the Big Ten and their first game in conference was against Minnesota.
At their own, at TCF Stadium, 31-26, Minnesota played a great game. They did what they had to do. The fact that Tyler Morgan was 18 for 20, 339, 3 touchdowns. Rashad Bateman, 7 catches, 203 yards, a touchdown. They exposed Penn State's secondary. They made them look slow. Minnesota is probably going to be your Big Ten West champ, and you're looking at them possibly playing Ohio State for the Big Ten championship and maybe a chance at playing in the playoff.
Well, that was impressive by Minnesota at home. That was a signature win for PJ Fleck. I mean, at home, and they got it done. And the one thing I was looking for with Minnesota was that back end of their defense is phenomenal. They went into the game leading the Big Ten in interceptions as a team, and what they do, well, they picked Sean Clifford apart during the game. With that back half ball hawking, Antoine Winfield got 2 picks. Jordan Howden had 1. That's the type of defense they are. They're ball hawking, and that back end is phenomenal. And they're not afraid to come up and stop the run too. And that to me was impressive. It looked like a Minnesota type playoff game, with the Vikings, how cold and raw and gray it was outside. I mean, that's what you want when you have big games in Minnesota. But yeah, I'm thoroughly impressed with the Gophers.
A good win. They've got a couple of tough games coming up still. No guarantee they run the table, but it's looking pretty promising at this point. Want to hit another undefeated team here before we wrap things up here in the first block of the review. And that's your leader right now in the clubhouse in the Big 12, the Baylor Bears. They didn't win pretty. It was a game that was 9-9 at the end of regulation. It ended up 29-23. Baylor gets the win over a tough and determined TCU team. Is Baylor for real?
Well, and I failed to mention Matt Rule as a candidate for Arkansas because I think that's another guy that they should be looking at too. But look, they're winning ugly, and I think Baylor's for real, and it looks like they could be in that Big 12 championship game. Great, when you go up against TCU, it's going to get ugly because their defense is scrappy, and they're kind of keeping the Horned Frogs, within puncher's chance of a bowl game. But Baylor's got two tough games coming up. Both of them, though, at home in Waco. They've got Oklahoma coming in, and if they can get that win, it almost assures them of first place and being able to wear the dark jerseys in Dallas for the championship game,
against Oklahoma.
Against Oklahoma. But then they got Texas coming in to Waco on the 23rd, and that's going to be a charged atmosphere. And after those two games, then they go to Lawrence to play Kansas, which I would kind of look at that game.
Trap.
If they get past Oklahoma and Texas, and they're undefeated going into that Kansas game, I mean, they've probably expended a lot of energy in those two wins. If they get those two wins against those two big time programs, and the letdown might happen in Lawrence. It's going to be cold and raw, and the Mad Professor, Les Miles, the Mad Hatter, is going to have something up his sleeve for Baylor. But Baylor's the type of team that can win ugly. They can beat you in the trenches, and I like them a lot.
Yeah, and it's interesting. They're catching Oklahoma on somewhat of a stretch of tough games. The Sooners beat Iowa State this past week, but they got lucky to do it, and that's coming off of a loss.
Right.
And when I say they got lucky to do it, it took intercepting a 2-point conversion with less than 20 seconds to go in order to hold off Iowa State from making a huge comeback in the fourth quarter and winning the game. Oklahoma looks vulnerable.
Yeah, they've had some injury issues, but they do look vulnerable. This Baylor game on Saturday is going to be a test for Oklahoma and for Jalen Hurts. They just haven't been getting the offensive production that they got at the beginning of the year, and the defense is kind of slipped a little bit. They had done really well up until this point, but you got Baylor, you got TCU coming to Memorial Stadium in Norman for your final home game, and it's Bedlam. Oklahoma could very easily go 1-2 in that stretch.
Yep.
However, I think they're going to be fired up enough against Baylor. I mean, that's really a pick'em game. I don't pick the Oklahoma State game because I refuse to pick big time rival games like that, especially at the end of the year. But Alex Grinch's defense is, showing some holes right now, showing some vulnerability. And I think at the beginning of the year, they were really the difference. Oklahoma's defense has not played well the last few years. They make the change with Alex Grinch. It seemed to pay dividends, but they've got some injuries right now. And the Big 12, they like to do these tough games in November. And I got to tip my hat off to them for doing that. So there you go. It's a tough stretch. Oklahoma has got some issues to overcome, but this Baylor-Oklahoma game should be fantastic.
Yeah, I can't wait to see if one of those teams is able to beat the other twice in the span of a month, because really that's what it's going to come down to. Want to wrap things up here in the first block of the show. We got another block to go, and that block, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the college football playoff, some of the teams worthy, some of the teams maybe not so worthy, and take a look ahead at a week where we're going to start seeing things separate out a little bit. All that and more when we come back to the review here on the OSG Sports Podcasting Network.
The online sports guys would love to hear from you. Go to our Twitter page at OSG Sports for a comment, rant, or just whatever's on your mind about college football.
Soccer Down Here is sponsored by Apolinsky & Associates, LLC, personal injury lawyers with over 30 years of experience. Call Steve Apolinsky at 518-350-4231 or email him at steve@aa-legal.com if you need help with a wrongful death or serious injury matter. Steve Apolinsky is rated one of the top 100 trial attorneys in Georgia, recognized as Legal Elite by Georgia Trend magazine for being one of the most effective lawyers in Georgia.
If you want to scale a mountain, buy boots. If you want to turn your crush into something more, say hi. At Country Financial, we know protecting the things you love and preparing for tomorrow start with simple steps. So we help you take small steps today with insurance and financial services that can have a big impact on your family's future.
For all your home, auto, and life insurance needs, call Jason Wright at 678-568-6871.
Just a flesh wound. Look, stop that! Chicken! Chicken! Look, I'll have your leg!
Missed it by that much.
Thanks for sticking around, everybody. You are listening to the review. This is the Online Sports Guys, the OSG. We are talking college football, the week that was, and a little bit of a look at the week that will be. I am OSG Phil. Joining me today, Brother Wilkie at JWilkerson16. And in the first block, we talked about the big boys, the Power 5 schools, and some of the teams with some big wins. Just want to touch on a couple of games really fast here before we move on to what everybody wants to know about, which is the playoff and the schedule looking ahead. Big upset, or maybe not such a big upset. Appalachian State, coming off a loss to Georgia Southern, bounces back and takes down the inexplicably weird South Carolina Gamecocks.
Well, you know, I don't discount that loss by App State to Georgia Southern because, as you know, being a Georgia Southern grad, that is a rivalry game. And Georgia Southern came in smelling blood and got it done. Hats off to Eli Drinkwitz as he begins his audition for the Arkansas job or any other job that comes out that might want to pick him from Boone, North Carolina, because they basically swept the Carolina schools. They beat North Carolina back in September 21st. Now they've beaten South Carolina. Oh, by the way, they beat Coastal Carolina too. So we'll put them in there as well. But, you know, other than that blemish against Georgia Southern, I mean, this team is rolling. They closed at Georgia State, just right down the road from us, Phil. And then
Atlanta.
Final game, home game against Texas State, and then they close against Troy. All winnable games. They're looking at 11-1 record. They're not going to get that dream of a New Year's Six bowl, unfortunately, with that loss to Georgia Southern. But I tell you, that offenses can be fantastic. I know Ryan Helinski had a big game, but you know that defense from Appalachian State toughened up, and you know they've got some decent. Zach Thomas, a really good quarterback, has really flourished under the system of Eli Drinkwitz that Ryan Finley did last few years in NC State. And then you got Darrington Evans, who, did a really good job of keeping the chains moving against South Carolina. Statistically, he didn't look like he did much, but he got some big yards and moved the chains when he had to.
Want to talk about one more game. We talked in the first block about some coaches losing their jobs and some little bit of the pre-carousel talk. I want to give a shout out to Lovie Smith at Illinois. Lovie got Illini bowl eligible for the first time in like 172 years with a huge comeback win over Michigan State. Did not see this coming. At the beginning of the season, Illinois looked like they've looked over the last few seasons, and then all of a sudden, they're on a roll.
I think a lot of it has to do with Brandon Peters. He's really improved in his role at quarterback for the Illini, and he had a big game against Michigan State, and Michigan State is really starting to tank right now.
Yeah.
And, they got Michigan this week, And that's a critical game for the Spartans if they want to keep their bowl hopes alive, because right now they're standing at 4-5 on the year. But hats off to the Illini and Lovie Smith. I mean, that's a great win for the Illini. It kind of gets that fan base excited again. It's been a tough road lately for the Illini, but again, Brandon Peters has really done well, and Lovie Smith is his own defensive coordinator, and something has really done well since lately for.
It's clicked.
Yeah, it's clicked. I mean, they're figuring out things. Have you noticed how many times they get in the backfield of the opponent? I mean, they have stepped up their game, and good for the Illini. I'm happy to see them have some success this year on the gridiron.
Want to talk a little bit looking ahead. The college football playoff poll comes out on Tuesday. Probably going to be a few changes this week going in. Outside the obvious, LSU at number 1, Ohio State at number 2, Clemson at number 3. How do you think it's going to go from there?
Well, I think there'll be some movement. LSU, Ohio State to me is kind of does LSU kind of take over Ohio State, because Ohio State was number 1 last week, and it really looks like that if things hold serve, LSU and Ohio State might be meeting in the title game. Clemson is starting to really play well right now. They've got Wake Forest this week in Death Valley. The steam has been taken out of that game after Wake's lost last week or last Saturday. So Wake is not really in a position to challenge Clemson for that Atlantic Division title. They were in that position up until Saturday. And Clemson's probably going to be a 14-plus point favorite against Wake Forest, which is, many anticipated this might be the best game in the ACC this year. And it still might be, but it's really Clemson's going to, the way they're playing right now, the way Travis Etienne is running and putting himself in the top 5 of the Heisman Trophy race. Trevor Lawrence is doing Trevor Lawrence things. That defense is just playing fantastic. It's Clemson. I mean, they're going to run the table and get into the playoffs. So, that 4 spot, it wouldn't shock me if Minnesota I think Baylor's got too much ground to cover to get up there, but I kind of think it wouldn't shock me if we saw Minnesota. And if that's the case, we have 2 Big Ten teams in the top 4. That's going to make some SEC people stand up and notice.
Well, there's an argument that could be made for it. Alabama did not look very good in their game against LSU. They have not played a top flight schedule. They don't have a win. They don't have a win period over a ranked team. The only other SEC team with any kind of a case right now is the University of Georgia. The Bulldogs haven't given up a running touchdown the entire season. They beat Mizzou this week 27-0 in a game where they dominated the Tigers and who were playing their backup quarterback, and Georgia's run up against quite a few of those. I don't see this Georgia team being a team that's got all the pieces to compete for the top 4, but then it's a whole bunch of other people that fall into place here. You've got Oklahoma still can make a little bit of an argument.
Oklahoma's toughest games are coming up, and that's why I think they've got a really good argument. Minnesota, they go to Iowa for the Florida-Rosedale game in Iowa City. That's going to be a tough one coming off that Penn State win. They'll beat Northwestern, and then they host Wisconsin. So Minnesota still has 2 really tough games within their division to play to help their resume. Again, it wouldn't shock me if we saw Minnesota in that 4 spot. And then we just went over Baylor's schedule a few minutes ago with Oklahoma and Texas. I mean, that if they go 2-0 in that stretch, and they're lucky their both games are in Waco, you got to start thinking about Baylor sneaking up and being that Big 12 team, at least at the 5 spot. They've got a lot of ground to make up in that poll. But you kind of think, especially if they beat Oklahoma, that they would more than likely be that Big 12 representative if they won out and won the title game. But I'm interested to see where Minnesota falls in this week's poll.
We are forgetting about the one team who could throw a monkey wrench in all of this, the Oregon Ducks. The Ducks, they have one loss. They lost their opening game of the season on essentially the last play of the game to a very good Auburn team on a neutral field. Outside of that, they just keep winning. Is the Pac-12 as good as the Big 10 or the Big 12 this year?
No.
I don't know necessarily that that's the case, but they've got some great wins. If Oregon wins out and Utah wins out, you're looking at 2 top 10 teams playing for the Pac-12 title. Oregon wins that game, I think you got a pretty good argument that they could be that number 4 team.
That's going to be a hard sell for me. I mean, I think that the Pac-12 is still kind of has a perception issue. They're probably better right now than the ACC right now as a league as a whole. But I think it's still a hard sell, especially when you've got a mediocre Arizona and Arizona State and Oregon State. Oregon State's played much better this year, but that game's in the Oregon State game. The Civil War game is in Eugene, so you can see Oregon running the table. You just look at their schedule, and they won at Washington. That's impressive, but unfortunately, you got to win impressively with the scores, and you just don't see that on Oregon's resume. Now, if they do that in the last 3 games, then maybe that'll change things. But I think it's a hard sell really for Oregon to be in that title game or in the playoff if they run the table and win the championship against Utah. Again, it's going to be a championship game no one watches. That's the issue. And, was it on Friday night again? And it's just not going to be compelling.
They're still a year away from moving the game to Las Vegas because that stadium's not ready. So I think they're playing in Santa Clara again.
Yeah, and no one's going to be there. No one's going to watch. And then you've got, the saving grace for the ACC is Clemson, and they've been in the playoff and won the 2 of the last 3 national titles. So that's what helps the ACC because they got nobody else worthy in that league. And they've been winning impressively, where I just don't see that with Oregon. But again, it's a hard sell for me as far as Oregon getting in there.
Going to be an interesting week ahead, needless to say. Just want to wrap things up here. We wanted to try to get through this show fairly quickly today due to time constraints. Got anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I think we've got some really good games this week. Auburn, Georgia, that should be a fun one to watch. It's going to be another great week of college football. We'll see if Odell Higgins can keep the winning ways going for Florida State and he can get them in a bowl game. And we'll see how
Give us a promo for the trophy and rivalry and trophy game show. What do you got coming up this week?
Well, this week we're really starting to crank out the rivalries in the lower divisions as they wrap up their seasons and head for their playoffs. One of my favorite rivalries that we hope to hear from is the Battle of the Monon Bell in Indiana between Wabash and DePaul. They have their own song, which you heard last year on our trophy game show, and we're looking forward to bringing that back out. In Division II, you've got the Battle of the Ravine between Henderson State and Ouachita Baptist in my home state. Where we're located in Georgia, it's the Peach State Bragging Rights Trophy between West Georgia and Valdosta State. And, of course, you've got in FCS, the Boombox Classic, Southern and Jackson State, the Hoosier Helmet between Valparaiso and Butler. But, of course, we've got the South's oldest rivalry, the Deep South's oldest rivalry, Georgia and Auburn. Bill Shanks will be on to talk about that one. We got the Paul Bunyan Trophy between Michigan and Michigan State, the Florida Rosedale between Iowa and Minnesota, and the Bridger Rifle between Wyoming and Utah State. So we'll spin the wheel and we'll see which ones will play, and we'll have a show.
Sounds like a good plan. You can catch that along with this show and so many other college football podcasts on the OSG Sports Podcasting Network. Make sure to find us on Google Play and in the Apple Store. The phone app is free if you want to download that, because that's where you get all of our programming in one handy-dandy little place. And I would be derelict in my duty if I didn't mention the social media aspect. We are on Facebook and on Twitter at OSG Sports. Check it out. Let us know what you think. Do you like the shows? Do you like what we're doing? You got some input, some things you want to talk about, or you'd like to hear us talk about us? Let us know. With all that being said, I will wrap things up for the week. For Jay Wilkerson 16, I am OSG Phil. We are the Online Sports Guys, and you have been listening to the review on the OSG Sports Podcasting Network.
The OSG app is up and running on your Android or iPhone. Install the OSG app and listen to our podcast from college football, soccer, and lacrosse. What are you waiting for? Download the OSG app today.